Hey, it's Kat, and I'm back because what once was will be again. We're going to use history to divine the mysteries of the Game of Thrones. In this segment, we're going to talk about Season 6, Episode 7, The Siege at Riverrun. Set it up. Blackfish has taken back the castle. He knew all the secrets, so he easily took it back from the Freys. Now the Freys have been putting it under siege very badly, probably allowing him plenty of opportunity to get resupplied in the castle via the river, or even sending out foraging parties, as the Freys haven't done a very good job setting up a perimeter. In comes Jaime Lannister, and he has thousands of forces against this one castle. At first, it might look like he has an advantage. You see 10,000 men coming up on a castle that maybe has 300 to 500 defenders inside, and that's if you're lucky. It seems like they would totally have the advantage. But in fact, besieging a castle is not that easy, and Blackfish has reminded Jaime of that fact, that he has a year or 2 years worth of supplies in there. Is he bluffing? Maybe, but even if he only had 30 to 60 days of supplies, that's a long time to hold a siege army outside of a castle. It becomes very expensive. You don't even have to have a straight-on fight. In history, even with cannon, knocking down a castle wall or getting inside is a long, arduous, and very costly task. In fact, even if you have cannon and siege engines doing most of the work, you're still paying a very large army to sit around and do nothing. They're eating you out of house and home. They probably foraged, pillaged, and raped around the countryside, taking everything that there was. And within 30 days, it's very difficult to maintain that army. Worse yet, when you've got a military camp that kind of size, the very likelihood that disease begins to set in and run rampant throughout the forces. And in fact, as was the case through most military history until the 20th century, the highest number of casualties was most often from disease. You could lose up to 30% of your men. And at that point, the besieging army becomes the vulnerable, because they could either be attacked from the castle, they could come out of the castle and attack them, or another enemy, seeing them in a weakened position, could come and attack them. And that's one of the other ways in which a siege is often broke on a castle. Or just eventually, men desert, you're out of money, you have other things going on. You've left your other castles, for instance, King's Landing, vulnerable to possible attack from others. So staying there for more than a few weeks is really not an option for any army. It totally reminded me of the siege of Vienna in 1683. In fact, Vienna had been placed under siege twice by the Ottoman Empire, and both times were a failure. The Sultan had come out of Baghdad and had been marching through Europe, basically kicking everybody's ass. When he got to Vienna, he placed it under siege, and that siege lasted for months. His army began to deteriorate. He didn't have enough resources, food. They were deserting like rats from a sinking ship. And lo and behold, while he's got Vienna under siege, in Baghdad, one of his enemies decided to take over and had placed Baghdad under attack, and he was going to come over and take over as the Caliph. So there it was. The Sultan had to break his siege of Vienna and run back to Baghdad to protect his home base. And that is the concern of Jaime right now. He's talked about Cersei's in King's Landing, and they have enemies and attacks. So that's just a representation of the very real things that happen in life. You can't just park an army outside of a castle. You don't have forever. You are vulnerable. So then we have Blackfish reminding Jaime that he is not very good at keeping his oath. he basically did some psychological warfare on Jaime. So Jaime came up with his thousands of men and banners flying, and they set up this big tent. He's trying to impress upon him the strength of his abilities, but Blackfish said, I'm behind this wall. What can you do? Because that's the truth. It's very costly to assault a castle. Costs you hundreds of men. The whole point is not necessarily just to waste men. You need your army to remain intact against other potential threats. So he's reminding him that that he isn't in the strongest position, and then he gets a little his own psychological warfare. I took your measure, and I found you wanting. Boom. He reminds Jaime he's the Oathbreaker. He didn't bring Sansa and Arya back. He killed the king. Why might I make a treaty with you? Who are you? You're not going to hold your part of the treaty up. We know that in the program, in the previews, it's saying that Brianna Tarth is coming. And as soon as I saw the picture of her coming up over the hill and we see the image of the castle, it totally reminded me of another siege in history, and that was the Siege of Orleans. And the fact is that Brianna Tarth in history is Joan of Arc. So at the Siege of Orleans, Orleans had been put under siege by the English. It was 1429. The Dauphin in France not been very successful for a while. Finally, she gets her sword and her armor and her banner, and she rides up to the front, and as she goes up to the front, she gets a bunch of men following her. Not that that's happening in this particular instance, but again, it just reminded me of that. And she rode up to the front, and all these guys were arguing about how to take care of it, and she just rode straight into the mass. She's like, screw this, we're going. And everybody followed her, and in fact, they broke the siege of Orleans. Now, I don't see that happening here because I believe that we have some other things that are impacting, such as Jon Snow and Sansa are free in the north. We should be definitely reminding ourselves that Brienne of Tarth is in fact Joan of Arc, and her character has a particular arc in history that may impact Brienne in the future, and we'll talk about that at another time. But back to other sieges in history. This is the War of the Roses. Mr. Martin likes to mix and match his timelines around so that events that would have happened previously are actually happening in the same time frame as other things, like Henry Tudor and the possible Battle of the Bastards. In this case, right before Henry Tudor, you'll see my video about the Battle of the Bastards and Jon Snow being Henry VII or Henry Tudor right now. Before he came on the scene, they were still trying to get Mad King Henry VI back on the throne because there was still Prince Edmund who could take his place, would be risen up. And at that point, Jasper Tudor, who is Henry Tudor's uncle, before he took Henry Tudor on, he was going around with Margaret of Anjou, being her right-hand man, basically hat in hand, begging for reinforcements, much like you see Sansa and Jon Snow doing right now, and pretty much with the same effect. At this point, Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrians had lost a number of armies in the field. So they set up a court in exile in Scotland, and they were asking the Scottish Queen Mary, could she give them forces? And just like Lyanna of Mormont, she basically was like, well, I could give you 300. What? We're talking about Scotland. Scotland's pretty big. They have a lot of men, but that wasn't the deal. Scotland was playing both ends. There was a piece of land that they wanted back. They were under negotiations with Edward IV. Margaret of Anjou promised that they would get it back, but really, she's promising from an Exile Court she could get a deal from Edward IV. But in the meantime, he's not moving very fast on that, so why not, provide a thorn in his side? So they provide some forces, just enough to give these guys a little, hey, we might help you some more. So they go down, and there's 3 castles that are nominally held by Lancastrian men, because at this point, it's pretty expensive to garrison and provide soldiers for a castle. So, during a war, if you don't have to besiege them, you don't want to. If you can do a deal with the guy inside and say, hey, give me your loyalty, and I won't attack you and you're good, we're all good. and make him have the expense of putting men and whatever on there. Great. So long as everything's peaceful, awesome. And that's exactly what Edward IV did. But these men were still Lancastrians. So when the Lancasters came back into the country, they immediately flipped over. So at this castle of Bamboo, the king and queen had been there. And Warwick the Kingmaker, he was almost a military genius, really. He had heard that they were there. So he quickly drew up an army of 10,000 men and went to this castle, but he was too late. Margaret and King Henry had already left, but who was there was Jasper Tudor and about 300 men. Along comes Warwick with 10,000 men. He looked just like Jaime Lannister's army. And you can imagine his colors were burgundy or crimson. He had banners flying. Warwick knew how to use the imagery to impress upon his enemies that they were about to get an ass whooping. But here's the deal. The siege was taking 30 days, and it's very costly. It's costly to Warwick's pocket, and he can't really get money back from the king. Maybe the king will give him some more lands or something that will eventually make up for the expenses of his army in the field. But it's not good to keep an army in the field very long. On top of that, Edward IV is like, hey, it's costing a lot of damn money to keep putting down these rebellions. Cut a deal. Cut a deal. So, but who comes to cut the deal is not Warwick himself, but his younger brother, John Neville, who reminded me very much of Jaime Lancaster. He was not interested in laying siege for a long period of time to this stupid little castle. Sure, Jasper Tudor was in there, but the king and queen were all gone. What was he going to get out of it? Jasper Tudor? He wouldn't get a reward for that. And the king was like, hurry up and finish this up. So that's exactly what they did. They did a deal where most of the forces under Jasper Tudor left the castle, but Sir Henry Percy, the Lancastrian who'd been holding it in the first place, was still going to hold the castle. He held the castle. Jasper Tudor and those guys leave. So what I think we might see here, definitely Blackfish has been making a big deal about his oath to Catelyn and how the war still goes on so long as he holds this castle. But really, the war isn't in this castle. The war is out there. Jon Snow and Sansa is still out there. Brienne's coming with a message. Does he take this message? A smart man would take the message, march his ass out there, and go join the army out there. On the other hand, he doesn't know what exactly he's risking if he gives up this castle and he goes out there. What's the possibility of success? He doesn't really know what Jon and Sansa's position is. If he holds this castle, he has a long period of time. But the truth of the matter is, if Jon and Sansa are not successful out there, there's going to be no one coming to break the siege on his castle. He will be stuck with either those guys giving up or him surrendering and probably being executed. So I think the smart idea is for him to leave, because he knows the castle and he knows how to get back in. But is he so stuck on the old that he can't go do the new? We won't know yet. But I think there's a possibility also Edmure was being cleaned up, being fed. Maybe Jaime is like, hey, I'll stick your nephew in charge as long as he swears fealty to me and the phrase. He'll be in charge. You go as long as you leave. So there's a Tully here. Could be a Dill. All right. But there you go. There's some sieges in history, how they go down. Think about Brianna Tarth. Brianna Tarth, Joan of Arc. We'll talk more about that later.
Knowledge.